Iowa City is a unique community. This uniqueness is shaped by the people who contribute their ideas, their gifts, and their energy to the life of Iowa City and the university. Welcome to a series of biographical interviews of special women and men who have affected this community. Their contributions have been valuable, their lives creative and full. What brought them here? Who influenced them? What contributions have pleased them the most? These and other questions will be explored during this series of interviews entitled, Tell Me Your Story. Susan Keene Boyd, a native of Minnesota, is a well-known and well-loved friend of Iowa City and the university. She has embraced many avocations and vocations over the years as a newspaper reporter, an author, a magazine contributor, a journal editor, a professional staff member, a volunteer, a wife, mother, and now a grandmother. Currently a resident of Chicago, Susan was an active participant in our community for many years. Besides raising a family in Iowa City, entertaining hundreds of students, continuing her writing, contributing to various university and community organizations, she was a professional staff member of the Patient Representative Program at university hospitals for many years. Her efforts at the hospital made a lasting difference to many patients and families. Susan is currently chair of the President's Club and is a member of the University of Iowa Foundation Board. Susan and her husband Sandy raised 3 children in Iowa City, Betsy, Bill, and Tom. They have 2 grandchildren, Ross and Charlie. While Susan Boyd maintained her own identity and uniqueness in spite of being married to the very visible president of the University of Iowa. Welcome, Susan, to Tell Me Your Story.
Delighted to be here.
Your story begins in Minneapolis on February 19th, 1926, where you were born.
Indeed.
Tell me a little bit about your parents and if you have siblings.
Yes. I have 3 sisters to start with and a brother. Our parents were both of German descent, although neither one came from Germany, but they happened to be brought up in the same neighborhood in northeast Minneapolis, so their parents were good friends. Then the families moved to North Minneapolis, and they continued this friendship, and my mother's older sister was actually my father's piano teacher. And so there was always a close relationship. But Mother was a few years behind Dad in high school, and so the romance didn't flourish until later on. When she was, I believe she was at the University of Minnesota, where she was a wonderful student, a French major. I always thought she was an English major, which made me think I was going to be a writer, because she was such a good writer. Turned out later she was a French major. But she was a Phi Beta Kappa, and she was the editor of, one of the editors of the, night editors of the Minnesota Daily during the war. My father, in the meantime, had intended to go to the University of Minnesota. He had taken a summer job during high school, and he did not like, it was in a dry goods company, as they called them then. He did not like the smell of cloth, so he went into the flour milling and grain business, at first as a messenger boy. He liked it so much that he never left the company. When he left the company, it was at his retirement, and he was president of the company. It was the flour milling division of Peavey.
That's
And one of my favorite stories of him, he always loved his job. And there was a joke that we'd come home from vacation a little early because he thought he had to take care of something. But he went to Detroit once on business when he was quite young, before Mother and Dad were married. And first of all, he thought he wouldn't survive it. It was so far away. It was so scary. But it was a very hot train, and he couldn't breathe, and so he opened up the window, and he fell right asleep. The next morning, he realized there was another window out there, sort of the country boy.
Yeah.
But he had a very successful career, and I'm very proud of him because he retired at the age they had to retire. And my mother had just died, and they were planning to travel, and he turned out to have great inner resources and kept himself very busy and occupied, and was able to stay in his own home even after having a stroke. So
that's a wonderful story, Susan.
And then I forgot about my sisters. Do you want me to?
Oh yeah, just tell me where they are.
Yes. I'm the oldest. My next sister is a chemist, and she started out in the beer industry on the West Coast. She was national head of the Hams Brewery Labs, and then went with Hugh Blind and has lived in Hartford, Connecticut, spent 4 years in Portugal, where she was a quality assurance expert. My next sibling is Barbara, and she became an engineer when she was 50, and she works for Northern States Power. My brother, Henry, I was 13 when he was born. He lives in Evanston, and he is an engineer with a graduate degree in business, and he is currently CEO of 3 medium-sized companies. So he does a lot of running from one to another.
Well, you have your mother's gene code of writing. So here you were, you said your mother was a wonderful writer, and you went off to Wellesley College because they had a good writing program.
Yes.
Tell me, you had some wonderful summer experiences when I was doing research about you. You worked for Mademoiselle 2 summers.
Yes.
You interviewed people?
Yes. The first summer was kind of a dream come true. Mademoiselle in those days had something called college editors. And those were people who went through competitions, and they chose the 14 winners of the competitions if you had a high score on these. I felt I was not going to make it, but I decided I'd keep pushing through it, and I was one of the winners. One of our opportunities, we literally edited the magazine, which would be impossible today because it takes so long in advance. But one of my jobs was working on a feature called We Hitch Our Wagon, and the rest of that was to a star. So I got not only to meet my own star, who happened to be the writer Thomas Mann, but I got to accompany the other editor, half of the other editors, on their interviews. So we met people like Hattie Carnegie, who was a designer, James Thurber, Mark Chagall.
And Carson McCullers?
And Carson McCullers I met because her sister was my boss. Her sister was the assistant fiction editor. I was invited to a party at their home. One of the first weekends I was in this editorship only lasted through the month of June. But one Sunday night we went to the home of Rita Smith, where her sister Carson McCullers was staying.
Oh, that's, you
And
brought
we shared a birthday, so we had that in common, and she was very kind to me about my wanting to write. She was I was 19 at the time, and she was 29.
29.
And she had just finished The Member of the Wedding, which was in a box in the basement. Somebody said, "There's the book."
When you interviewed, I just have to add, when you interviewed Thomas Mann,
Yes.
and was he very accessible? Was he
He was the dearest man, and I was such a newcomer to interviewing. I went with a photographer who was very knowledgeable, and when this old elderly man, not terribly old, but elderly, answered the door, I wasn't sure it was Thomas Mann, but she said, "How do you do? Here we are from Mademoiselle, Mr. Mann." And so I then started ripping off all the names of the titles I'd read in my German class. And he looked at me rather quizzically and said, "Oh, the Magic Mountain." My German was very poor. He was lovely. I told him about wanting to write. He told me about writing his book, Budenbrooks, when he was 19. And having been very stubborn about having the entire thing appear and not be changed. He said, "Now, don't you get it changed, what you're writing." And he was very flattering and
very
pleasant
gracious.
and very, very encouraging. We had been told to stay no more than 30 minutes. We stayed at least 45, and finally the photographer had the presence of mind to realize he was too nice a man to say we must leave. So we then got up and departed, but it was a wonderful memory. He asked me to send pictures. I did. And it was very pleasant.
After Wellesley, you were offered a job on the Minneapolis Tribune. Tell me about this part of your story.
Well, it was pretty exciting. I didn't get the job right away. I kept interviewing the editor, and he kept writing me and saying letters when I wrote to thank him, saying that he always remembered my hat and wasn't it nice, and why didn't I come in another time? And I did. One Easter, right before I graduated, I went for Easter to the home of my sister's roommate in New York. her aunt, who was a well-known columnist named Ines Robb, and I give her great credit for this, drove me back to the city. We were outside of New York, and she asked me what I wanted to do, and I said, I'd love to be a newspaper reporter. She said, Bill Stevens has to hear about you, so she wrote a letter. This was the man who had been very nice, but very non-committal. It was the
Is it because you were a woman?
There weren't many women. There were a few, but they were just coming in. And he wrote me then in answer to that letter and said, Ines Robb mentioned you, and why don't you come in for a chat? So I did. I had no journalism background. I had taken creative writing. And so my first assignment was to go to the Minnesota State Fair and write lists of the canning and baking winners. And it was pretty exciting in a way just to be out there in a newspaper office with all these wonderful people. And it turned out I used the wrong style. So a very fine editor back at the main office was changing my punctuation and so forth, and throwing me a style book so I'd do it right, and I did learn to do it right. And then we had some pretty exciting stories about somebody supposedly being held captive in the, what is the Iron Lung in those days. That was on the Midway.
And you covered accidents?
And I covered accidents, yes.
And this was the era that Hubert Humphrey was mayor of Minneapolis.
Was mayor, and he had signed my press card. I still have that press card signed by him. A very genial and wonderful person who had many friends on the
What a heady time for you.
It was.
What fun. Was that when they asked you to work then on the society page? And
I had worked for a year on the general news, covering fires and accidents and meeting celebrities and having a kind of wonderful schedule of 1 to 10 at night or 2 to 11. One day, 2 of the society editors came back from lunch in a condition that made the boss decide that they were out. And a very good friend of mine, Barbara Flanagan, and I were given the assignment very abruptly of going immediately to the society department and starting to write society news. In those days, it was a matter of calling up people and asking them if we'd tell them about their trips south and what parties they were giving. People were reluctant to do that, and it was very hard. And it was not a job I totally enjoyed, but my father, I remember, took me to lunch and said, now you've got to make the best of it, which was very good advice, and stick with it. In addition to that, I was doing sidewalk interviews asking such deep questions as, what is your favorite color? And I'd get the answer, and then people would tap me on the shoulder and say, I don't want that in the paper.
Yeah, right.
Take it away.
Oh, that's good. You were awarded a wonderful writing fellowship at Stanford, and you were studying under Wallace Stegner.
Yes, that was a big thrill.
Was that for a year?
It was for a year, and the scholarship was given, fellowship I guess it was given to 6 writers. And the stipend was big enough so that we did not have to worry about any living expenses. You just went out there and you lived on that money. Nothing you did would disqualify you. Once you were out there, you stayed. I was one of the fiction writers, and so I spent the entire year doing nothing but writing. And it was a very sobering experience. Suddenly I was among such good writers that I was afraid I didn't have anything worth reading, and it took me about 3 months before I showed anything in class. But I did write, totally.
Then you were, okay, that was a year. Then you came back to the Minneapolis Tribune, and about this time, here you were knee-deep into your career, but somebody wanted to line you up with a lawyer in town. Is this correct?
Yes, yes.
What happened?
And this had been after I'd worked for probably about 6 years. I had a couple of friends from college who would mention from time to time that they had a young man in mind that they'd like to have me meet. They apparently were telling him the same thing. I think we were both fairly resistant because we were both having a nice time doing what we were in our careers. I enjoyed my work, and he was enjoying being a lawyer. So we didn't get together for a while, and then there was a Wellesley alumni party. And his boss, who was married, his boss at the law firm, was married to a classmate of mine, and they invited the 2 of us to join them at this party. And so off we went, and it was very nice. We didn't date heavily after that, but we did start to see each other. And I think we both felt that we would have a fine time just living on in Minneapolis and being sort of, casually engaged. We became engaged, we met in the spring and we were engaged the next winter. And then lo and behold, the dean of the Iowa Law School called to invite Sandy to come and teach at Iowa. And that meant either traveling down to visit him or going down there.
So you got married and came to Iowa, and we're so lucky you did.
Yes,
I'm
we were
so
very
glad
lucky.
you came.
I was surprised in a way, because this wasn't what I thought we were going to be doing. But I was very excited about the Iowa Writers' Workshop. So I thought this would be a fun thing to try for a little while. After about a year passed, it wasn't just a little while. We both were enjoying it so much we became permanent citizens. Very committed. It was hard to leave when we finally left, 27 years later.
You had 3 small children, but you managed to write. When I see that when you came to Iowa and Betsy came and Bill and Tom, you were writing and getting your work published in Mademoiselle and Red Book and Harper's and Writer magazine. Where did you find the time, and when did you write? At night after the kids were in bed, or what?
Well, I was rather unkind about naps for children. Betsy, our oldest, was very cooperative, and I would try to write when she was napping. Then we had Bill, and Bill didn't like to nap that much, and Tom definitely didn't. So what I finally did was choose Thursday as the day that I would go and go to the library. And I'd take my typewriter. In those days, I don't know if you can still do that.
I don't, at the university library or
the
here?
University library. Yes, the university library. I'd take my lunch, and I'd spend the whole day in a room that you could type in.
What do you like to, are you mostly a fiction writer or a nonfiction writer?
I'm mostly a fiction writer.
You're mostly a fiction writer.
I like short stories, are my favorite form.
When you were here for, I don't know, it must have been 10, 12 years, your husband moved into administration, and then he was tapped for the president of the university. You probably were the most visible family in Iowa City. How did you handle that, or how did you work on that, and not trying to be so much in a fishbowl? Because you were right on River Street.
Yes. I think it helped that we stayed in our own house. It was not intentional because of family reasons. The tuition had been raised, and Sandy thought it was an appropriate gesture for us to stay on in the house and then use the official president's house upper stories to house the Institute for Urban and Regional Research, which needed some new quarters, and it would save money for the university. I think that move was wise for that time for our family, because even though we were visible in a neighborhood, and we had very supportive neighbors. There were some demonstrations that followed on Sandy's arrival in the presidency. One of the stories, which doesn't have total connection with your question but makes me think about being visible, was one night we were asked, and it was before Sandy was president, to go to Coco and Carol's as fill-ins for the Bowens, our dear friends, those wonderful Bowens. And in those days, it was in the Iowa Memorial Union. Student activity leaders brought their Christmas decorations, and then each group put it on a tree, and then Coco and Carol's were served. As was happening fairly often in those days, our children came along with us, and they were very cooperative about it, but sometimes a little less than enthusiastic. I could see that Tom Boyd, who was then maybe 5 or younger, was becoming restive. We were sitting on a platform, and the audience was down there. They were not singing Jolly Christmas carols at the time. They were singing a kind of sad one that it was a memorial to somebody. And he started making a paper airplane, and he pulled back his arm to throw it. And I thought, oh, please, please, that's something, get us out of here. He fell asleep. It was a miracle.
A Christmas miracle.
Oh. But the children, I think by having the neighborhood around us,
Good point.
we had a very, what seemed to me a very nicely normal existence. I think had we moved in new as new President's family, we wouldn't have had the connection with our neighbors.
You became, besides writing and raising children, and Sandy was gone a lot, you became involved in a lot of volunteer efforts, as disparate as the International Wives Club, where you were in these wonderful style shows, but did a lot of good things, I know, with International Wives Club. But you also became a volunteer, which became a big part of your life, University Hospitals. Tell me a little bit about this period and then what you eventually did.
Yeah. I was very interested in working at university hospitals which had not had a volunteer program. And I'm not quite sure when it started. It must have been at the very late 60s or early 70s. And it was during the time Sandy was president that I mentioned to a friend that I would really like to join. And I had been asked if I would like to, and I had said yes. Well, somebody said, but you wouldn't want to, you're too busy. And I said, no. You know, I can always be busy, and it's kind of nice to have an excuse not to always be available to plan menus for the next tea that's coming up or something of the sort, because you could do that in chunks of time. So finally I persuaded them, and I went on as a guide, which was the first service. I have a terrible sense of direction. And so when one poor patient said, I think it's that way, they told me, I went back to headquarters. And at that point, they were starting a wonderful service called Patient Representative. And I was a volunteer visitor. I would go on Thursdays, as I recall, and visit people, not ask about any troubles they might have, just give them literature about where the cafeteria is and where various services were available. And then in the conversation with them, pick up any kind of complaints or worries, or if they had questions, try to get the answers to them. I later took a writing course in expository writing because my fiction was not selling at that point, and I thought, well, I'll try something new. And I was studying under a woman named Jane Howard, who's a fine writer. And it turned out that I was writing everything about my hospital experience, which was central to me. Part of the writing was doing a profile of Dr. Lois Bulwar. I went to interview her, even though I knew her well. I wanted to kind of firm it up. I think she didn't want me to do this. She doesn't like a lot of attention. And so to change the subject, she said, we have an opening. It's too bad you can't apply. So I thought, why can't I apply? And I spoke to Sandy about it. He felt that it was something I could try. And I did apply. They were going to take two half-time people to share a year. I was chosen as one of the people, but then there was a little problem. The regents had to be, the Board of Regents had to be approached. Half of them felt I should, half of them felt I shouldn't. One of the regents was going to sue the rest of the regents in my behalf. She was very loyal, but I didn't want to become the center of a controversy. And I didn't quite know how to handle it from then on. But the university decided, not because of me, but I was one of the contributing factors to relook their policy and really acknowledge the fact that many, many spouses in this area were being kept from giving their talents really in jobs. So it was worked out as long as the spouse in one couple was not to move on the promotion or other decisions of another. May Broadbeck, who was somebody I admired for many reasons, was instrumental in working this policy out.
And you shared it with Margie Nesser, and you did it for 6 years.
Yes.
I have to tell a little story on you. I remember when my mother was ill in university hospitals, and you were married to the president of the university, and I walked into her room, and you were washing her hair, and I have that just indelibly imprinted. It says a lot about you. And you did that for 6 years.
And I remember your mother so well, and what an experience she was for the doctors that were treating her, the young doctors.
Looking back over your years in Iowa City, was it your volunteer work at University Hospitals and then there's your staff that have maybe that kind of stands out as the most special thing you contributed to this community?
I think possibly so. I came away with the feeling that for every day I worked, somehow there was one moment somewhere during the day that probably made a difference for someone. And I think that was a contribution. It was a job I certainly enjoyed. I also think, in a small way, the fact that I had a job, I was the first university president's wife to work in a time when this was happening all over, or it was going to happen all over, but I think I was kind of a natural to do it because people knew me and it wasn't really threatening. Once I got the job, it was an accepted thing.
It's a good thing to share that job. That was worked out for your schedule.
It did work out very well, and Margie was very good about arranging her own schedule.
Tell me, Susan, what person in your life has made a profound difference to you? Has there been a couple people, many people, one person?
There have been a lot. May Broadbeck was
You
one.
mentioned May, yes. That
She had such a wonderful, clear mind, so much warmth and generosity, and she was really kind of all by herself as a woman leader, and I always admired that and felt for her too. That I would see her at lunches at the president's house, and she'd say, "Why don't you stay?" And there she was, all those men around who she liked a lot, but it's still being one alone.
A pioneer
and I'm so
out there.
Pleased, and I think now there are many people, all admirers of hers, who are still here, who are following in that line. Another person I remember with great admiration and love is Dorothy Pownell, who was on the newspaper when I came. We were in a lot of things together, and she was a fine writer. She was writing a column for the newspaper. Her Christmas poem is still printed, I think, every year in the paper. And her daughter, Ellie, became my good friend. Ellie, by the way, was also a Mademoiselle guest editor, but not during my year. And Ellie talks about Dorothy writing or playing a typewriter lullaby as she went to sleep. And I always thought that inspired me to write when I had children, that it was possible. So you could write after they were asleep. And she also gave wonderful parties and had the most marvelous wit. She and her husband, Fred, both.
That's lovely. Tell me, we're running out of time. There's so many things I want to ask you. Just tell me briefly about your children, where they are.
Yes. Betsy is here in Iowa City. She's married to Bill Nusser. They have two little boys, Ross, who's 6, and Charlie, who's 3. And I was just thinking last night, since I was at the university president's house, Betsy and Bill were married at the president's house, which was fun for all of us.
And then your son Bill is out in
Bill lives
the
in
East
Washington.
Coast?
He lives in Washington, D.C., and he is a lawyer. And he went to the Iowa Law School as a graduate of that, went to Michigan before that, and he is married to Diane Chingren Boyd, who is with a nonprofit group that brings bright high school students to Washington to learn about the government.
And then your youngest son, Tom, is up in the Twin Cities, I hear.
He's in his father's hometown, St. Paul. He called me to say where he had chosen to go, and I guessed all around, said Minneapolis, Kansas City, Chicago. He said, "Mother, St. Paul." His wife, Liz, is a lawyer in Minneapolis.
I want to just touch briefly. You're now in Chicago, and you've been there since 1981. You're continuing to write. You're editing a journal for the American Bar Association, and you're writing a history of the section of the American Bar Association. Are you having any time to volunteer, or is this being the wife of the president of the Field Museum? I'm sure you have a lot of obligations in that capacity.
I do some volunteering. One thing I do is I visit hospital patients whose names are sent to me, people who have had cancer surgery. And so I go talk to them. I am on the boards of some organizations which involve some volunteer work. One is Urban Gateways, which provides an arts and education experience for about 1 million children in the greater Chicago area. And children who are so isolated from the culture, the rich culture of Chicago, that they never get in to see any of the performances, and so the artists come out to the schools and work with the teachers and try to provide a real experience that enriches their whole educational life.
So you're not writing right now fiction, but you maybe when you come back to Iowa City in 1993, you might go back to...
Possibly so. I had been editing a publication and I quit in order to write, and I did write a lot of short stories for about a year. I have those short stories. I have not published any of them, so I have gone back into doing some nonfiction writing. But I'm hoping that it will be fairly soon that I will return to fiction.
Did you bring, you told me before the interview that you wrote a poem, which is not something, did you happen to bring it?
Yeah.
You did, could we close with your poem?
Certainly.
Okay.
Certainly. This is a poem that I wrote. I don't write poetry, but one day this poem just came to me. It was inspired by the birth and childhood of my daughter Betsy and my thoughts of an aunt whom she never had met.
What a lovely tribute.
It's called The Growing Chain. Two links on the same chain joined, but spaced too far apart in time to touch in meeting even once. In the same late summer month, one died, curved by the rigor of pain that bore deeper with every beating moment, to ravish flesh and remembered face. Yet pain carved a new face from bone and gallantry. Stranger still, it stirred laughter that flared beyond the bedside's grief-bound border. Not 2 weeks later, the other plunged out from crushing darkness into the pain-soaked splendor of noon. And now she rocks in ecstasy at beholding Christmas lights melting the snow, the sight of her own name written out, cold air, untried words balanced on her tongue. Crouching, speechless, she breathes smoke into the air and does not know at first that it is hers. How odd that they should laugh alike. They never knew each other, links though they were in the same chain that held them.
That's a fitting closing. Thank you, Susan, for being
You're
my
welcome.
guest. The story you have just heard is that of Susan Keene Boyd. Phrases used to describe her are communicator, listener, a people's person, sensitive to the needs of others, a calming influence, quiet leader, and without pretense. Susan lived in Iowa City for about 27 years, and for 27 years she made a difference in the lives of students. She enriched the fabric of the university, contributed her time and efforts to volunteer organizations that enhanced our community. Susan was a staff member in the Patient Representative Program at university hospitals, which benefited thousands of people. An author, a former reporter, editor, volunteer, administrator, wife, mother, and grandmother. Susan Boyd is a unique woman, and we are fortunate that part of her life story took place in Iowa City and the university.